The eviction notice landed on the breakfast tray like a death sentence. Dorothy Miller's weathered hands barely trembled as she read the words that would force her from the only home she'd known in 6 months. Brandon Walsh, the head administrator, stood over her with the kind of smirk that belonged on a man half his age and twice his importance. "Pack your bags, Grandma. We need the bed for someone who can actually pay full rate." But Dorothy didn't move. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." She sat perfectly still, her sharp blue eyes fixed on something beyond the window of Sunrise Manor's common room, something that made the morning air feel suddenly electric. Walsh followed her gaze to the parking lot, where 3 black SUVs had just pulled up in perfect formation. Men in tactical gear emerged with the kind of precision that made seasoned warriors look like weekend hobbyists. "Ma'am," the lead figure called across the lot, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never had to raise it. "We're here for Dorothy Miller." The room went silent. Walsh's smirk vanished like smoke. And somewhere in the back of Dorothy's mind, a switch flipped from civilian to something far more dangerous. Because sometimes, when you've spent decades protecting others, the universe decides it's time for others to protect you. The morning started like every other at Sunrise Manor Assisted Living in Cedar Falls, Ohio. The smell of institutional coffee mixed with antiseptic floated through corridors painted in colors meant to be cheerful, but somehow managed to feel more like a hospital, trying too hard to be a hotel. Dorothy Miller sat in her usual spot by the large window in the common room, watching the world wake up beyond the manicured lawn that separated the residents from the life they used to live. At 78, Dorothy had the kind of face that spoke of a life fully lived. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun that never seemed to have a strand out of place, and her blue eyes held a sharpness that most people half her age had already lost to screens and shortcuts. She wore a simple lavender cardigan over dark slacks, the kind of outfit that helped her blend into the background of a place where being noticed usually meant something was wrong. She'd been a resident of Sunrise Manor for exactly 6 months and 2 days, not that anyone was counting except Dorothy herself. She counted everything: the number of steps from her room to the dining hall, the rotation schedule of the nursing staff, the precise time the maintenance crews arrived each morning. Old habits, she told herself, though she'd never quite been able to explain to her daughter Margaret why those habits mattered. The other residents had grown accustomed to Dorothy's quiet presence. She helped Mrs. Patterson with her crossword puzzles every Tuesday. She reminded Mr. Frank Chen to take his heart medication without making him feel like a child. She kept the peace when arguments broke out over television channels or card games. The staff appreciated her too, mostly. Maria Santos, one of the day shift nurses, often said Dorothy was the easiest resident she'd ever worked with. But Brandon Walsh saw things differently. Walsh had been the head administrator at Sunrise Manor for 3 years, and in that time, he'd developed a reputation for running the facility like a business first and a care center second. He was 42, tall, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never having been genuinely challenged. His suits were always pressed, his teeth were professionally whitened, and his handshake was firm enough to remind you that he was in charge without quite crossing the line into aggression. Walsh had been watching Dorothy Miller since the day she arrived, not because she caused problems, but because she didn't cause enough of them. In his experience, residents who didn't complain, didn't demand attention, and didn't require extra medical care were either hiding something or weren't profitable enough to justify their bed space. Dorothy fell into both categories, and that made her a problem he intended to solve. The morning confrontation began innocently enough. Dorothy was sitting in her usual chair, reading a worn paperback novel that she'd probably read a dozen times before. The book was The Hunt for Red October, and if anyone had bothered to notice, they might have wondered why an elderly woman was so interested in military thrillers. But no one at Sunrise Manor paid that kind of attention to the details. Walsh approached her table with a manila folder in his hand, and that practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. He pulled out the chair across from her without asking permission and sat down with the kind of casual authority that people use when they want you to know they own the space you're occupying. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice carrying just enough false warmth to make the conversation feel official. "I hope you're having a pleasant morning." Dorothy looked up from her book, her finger marking her place on a page that described submarine warfare tactics with startling accuracy. "Good morning, Mr. Walsh," she replied, her voice steady and polite. There was something in her tone that suggested she already knew this wasn't a social call. "I'm afraid I have some rather unfortunate news," Walsh continued, opening the manila folder and pulling out a set of documents that had clearly been prepared in advance. "The facility has been conducting a review of our resident population, and we've had to make some difficult decisions about occupancy and care levels." He slid the papers across the table toward Dorothy, who glanced down at them without picking them up. The letterhead read "Notice of Lease Termination" in bold letters that seemed designed to intimidate rather than inform. "I don't understand," Dorothy said quietly, though her expression suggested she understood perfectly well. Walsh leaned back in his chair, adopting the posture of someone delivering news that was regrettable but unavoidable. "The simple truth, Mrs. Miller, is that your care needs don't align with our facility's new focus on high-acuity residents. You're too independent. You don't require the level of medical supervision that justifies the cost of your accommodation." Dorothy's hands remained perfectly still on the table. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But something shifted in her eyes. It was subtle, like the way water looks different just before it starts to boil. "Are you saying I'm being evicted because I'm not sick enough?" "I'm saying that Sunrise Manor is transitioning to serve residents who require more comprehensive care packages," Walsh replied, his tone suggesting that he'd had this conversation before and knew exactly how to navigate it. "There are plenty of senior housing options in the area that would be more appropriate for someone with your minimal needs." The common room had grown quieter around them, though neither Dorothy nor Walsh seemed to notice. Other residents had stopped their conversations and were listening with the kind of attention that people pay when they sense that something important is happening, even if they can't quite identify what it is. "How long do I have?" Dorothy asked, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone that Walsh completely missed. 30 days, he said, consulting the papers as if he needed to check, though he'd obviously written them himself. "That should give you plenty of time to make arrangements." Dorothy nodded slowly, her finger still marking her place in the book about submarine warfare. 30 days, she repeated, as if she were calculating something complex in her head. Walsh stood up, smoothing his tie in a gesture that was probably unconscious, but felt deliberately condescending. "I know this isn't the news you wanted to hear, Mrs. Miller, but I'm confident you'll find that this transition will be for the best. Sometimes change is exactly what we need, even when we don't realize it." He turned to walk away, clearly considering the conversation finished. But Dorothy's voice stopped him after he'd taken only 2 steps. "Mr. Walsh," she said, and something in her tone made him turn around despite himself. "Have you ever been in a situation where you thought you knew exactly what was happening, but you were completely wrong about everything that mattered?" Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly, as if he were surprised that Dorothy was continuing the conversation, instead of simply accepting his decision. "I'm not sure I follow your meaning, Mrs. Miller." Dorothy closed her book carefully, using a bookmark that looked like it had been made from an old military map. When she looked up at Walsh again, her expression hadn't changed, but somehow the quality of her attention felt different, more focused, more dangerous. "I'm sure you don't," she said simply. That evening, Dorothy sat in her room, reviewing the eviction notice, with the kind of methodical attention she'd once applied to mission briefings in places that didn't officially exist. Room 247 was small, but comfortable, with a window that overlooked the parking lot and a view of the tree line beyond. The room contained the usual institutional furniture that came with assisted living, but Dorothy had personalized it with a few carefully chosen items. On her nightstand sat a framed photograph that most people assumed showed her family. The picture was old and slightly faded, showing 4 women in what appeared to be hiking gear, standing on a mountain ridge with big smiles and wind-blown hair. Anyone who looked closely might have noticed that all 4 women had the same kind of lean build and alert posture, and that their hiking boots looked suspiciously like military issue. But most people didn't look that closely. Next to the photograph was a small compass on a silver chain, the kind of thing that might have been a retirement gift or a memento from a deceased husband. The compass was worn smooth from decades of handling, and if someone had examined it carefully, they might have noticed that it was far more sophisticated than any civilian hiking equipment had a right to be. Dorothy's small dresser held the usual collection of elderly woman's clothing, cardigans and slacks and comfortable shoes. But, in the bottom drawer, wrapped in a cloth that might have once been part of a military uniform, was a leather journal filled with handwriting that covered dates and locations spanning nearly 3 decades. The entries were brief and coded, but they told the story of operations that had never made it into official records and missions that had been classified so deeply that even their existence was a state secret. As Dorothy sat on her bed, reading Walsh's eviction notice for the 3rd time, she was also listening to the sounds of the building settling around her. She knew the routine of every staff member, the schedule of every security patrol, and the precise timing of when the building's electronic locks engaged for the night. She knew these things not because she was paranoid, but because awareness had kept her alive for 27 years, in places where a single moment of inattention could mean the difference between coming home and disappearing forever. She reached under her pillow and pulled out a small device that looked like a basic medical alert pendant, the kind that elderly people wore in case they fell and needed help. But this pendant had been modified with components that definitely hadn't come from a medical supply company. Dorothy held it in her palm for a long moment, considering options and consequences with the kind of tactical thinking that most people never develop and never need. The pendant was connected to a network that spanned continents and operated outside official military channels. It was the kind of communication system that retired operators used to stay in touch with active teams, sharing information and resources that helped everyone stay alive a little longer. Dorothy had never used it before. In 6 months at Sunrise Manor, she'd never felt the need to reach out to her old community. But 30 days to find a new place to live wasn't just an inconvenience for someone her age. It was a crisis that could leave her homeless, vulnerable, and cut off from the quiet stability she'd worked so hard to build. And Dorothy Miller had not survived 27 years of classified operations by accepting crises without fighting back. She pressed the pendant once, waited 3 seconds, then pressed it twice more. The sequence would send a coded message to a secure server that would route it to people who remembered when Dorothy Miller had been something other than an elderly woman in a nursing home. People who knew that sometimes the most dangerous operators were the ones who'd learned to hide in plain sight. The message was simple: situation developing. May need assistance. Location: Sunrise Manor, Cedar Falls, Ohio. Will advise. Dorothy tucked the pendant back under her pillow and settled in for the night. Outside her window, the parking lot was quiet under the streetlights, and the world beyond the tree line looked peaceful and ordinary. But Dorothy Miller had spent most of her adult life learning that peaceful and ordinary were usually illusions that lasted only until someone decided to look more closely. Tomorrow, she would begin planning her response to Brandon Walsh's ultimatum. Tonight, she would sleep the light, alert sleep of someone who'd learned that safety was something you created for yourself, not something you waited for others to provide. 3 time zones away, in a secure facility that didn't appear on any public maps, a communications specialist noted the incoming message from a sender whose code hadn't appeared in the system for over 6 months. The specialist cross-referenced the sender's identity with active operation databases and felt his pulse quicken slightly when he saw the classification level attached to the name Dorothy Miller. He forwarded the message to his shift supervisor with a priority flag that meant immediate attention required. The supervisor read the message twice, then picked up a secure phone and dialed a number that connected directly to the office of Admiral Rebecca Torres, current commander of Naval Special Warfare Group 4. Admiral Torres was working late, reviewing deployment schedules and training reports that would determine how America's most elite warriors spent the next 6 months. When her secure phone rang, she answered it immediately, because calls on that line came only when something required her personal attention. "Admiral Torres," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had been earned through decades of making decisions that affected national security. "Ma'am," the voice on the other end said, "we've received a priority communication from a legacy operator, someone who served under the Ghost Mother designation during the classified harbor operations of the 80s and 90s. Torres set down her pen and gave the call her complete attention. Ghost Mother was a designation that appeared in files so classified that even she needed special authorization to access them. The operations associated with that codename had prevented terrorist attacks, rescued hostages, and eliminated threats that the public would never know had existed." "What's the nature of the communication?" Torres asked. "The operator is requesting potential assistance. Current location is a civilian care facility in Ohio. The message suggests a developing situation that may require intervention." Torres was quiet for a moment, thinking about protocols and procedures that had been designed to protect operators who'd spent decades serving their country in ways that could never be officially acknowledged. These were people who'd sacrificed normal lives, normal relationships, and normal retirements to do work that others couldn't or wouldn't do. They deserve better than being forgotten when they needed help. "What assets do we have in that area?" she asked. "SEAL Team 6 is conducting training exercises at Camp Grayling in Michigan. That's approximately 4 hours from the reported location. Contact the team leader," Torres said. "Advise them that they may be asked to conduct a welfare check on a legacy operator. Full discretion authorized. I want options available if this situation escalates." As she hung up the phone, Admiral Torres made a note to personally review the file associated with the Ghost Mother designation. If Dorothy Miller was reaching out after years of silence, there was a good chance that whatever was happening in Cedar Falls, Ohio, was more serious than it appeared on the surface. Back at Sunrise Manor, Dorothy Miller slept peacefully in her narrow bed, unaware that her simple message had already begun to ripple through networks that spanned the globe. She didn't know that military planners were reviewing maps of her location, or that a team of the world's most elite warriors had just been placed on standby to respond to her call. All she knew was that Brandon Walsh had made a serious mistake when he'd assumed that a 78-year-old woman in a nursing home was powerless to fight back. Because Dorothy Miller had spent most of her life proving that the most dangerous opponents were usually the ones who looked the least threatening. And tomorrow she would begin to show him exactly how dangerous a cornered ghost could be. The morning after Dorothy received her eviction notice, Sunrise Manor felt different in ways that most people couldn't quite identify. The difference wasn't in the breakfast schedule, or the medication rounds, or the familiar rhythm of institutional life. It was in the air itself, like the atmospheric pressure change that comes before a storm that weather forecasters haven't predicted yet. Dorothy Miller sat at her usual table in the common room, but this morning she wasn't reading her military thriller or helping other residents with their daily routines. Instead, she was watching the parking lot with the kind of focused attention that most people reserved for television shows or conversations with loved ones. Her weathered hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her posture was as straight as always, but there was something in her stillness that suggested coiled energy rather than passive waiting. Maria Santos, the day shift nurse who'd grown fond of Dorothy's quiet competence, noticed the change immediately when she arrived for her shift at 7 in the morning. Maria had been working at Sunrise Manor for 5 years, and in that time she'd developed an instinct for reading the moods and needs of residents who couldn't always articulate what they were feeling. Dorothy's mood this morning was unlike anything Maria had seen before. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller," Maria said as she passed Dorothy's table on her way to check on other residents. "How are you feeling today?" Dorothy turned her attention from the window, and when she looked at Maria, her blue eyes held a warmth that seemed genuine, despite whatever was occupying her thoughts. "Good morning, Maria. I'm feeling quite well, thank you. How is your family?" The question was typical of Dorothy's considerate nature. But Maria noticed that even as Dorothy asked about her children and her husband's new job, part of her attention remained fixed on something beyond the conversation. It wasn't rudeness or distraction, but rather the kind of divided awareness that suggested Dorothy was monitoring multiple situations simultaneously. "Mrs. Miller," Maria said, lowering her voice slightly, "I heard about the notice you received yesterday. I want you to know that the nursing staff had nothing to do with that decision. We think you're one of the best residents we've ever had here." Dorothy's expression softened with genuine appreciation. "That's very kind of you to say, Maria. I know you and the other nurses work very hard to take care of everyone here. Is there anything I can do to help?" Maria asked. "I know some other facilities in the area, places that might be a better fit than what Mr. Walsh is suggesting." "I appreciate the offer," Dorothy replied. "But I think this situation may resolve itself in ways that Mr. Walsh isn't expecting." There was something in Dorothy's tone that made Maria pause. It wasn't defiance or anger or even determination. It was the kind of quiet confidence that people display when they know something important that others don't. Maria had heard that tone before, usually from family members who'd made decisions about their loved one's care without consulting the staff first. "Mrs. Miller," Maria said carefully, "you're not planning to do anything dramatic, are you?" Dorothy smiled, and for the first time since Maria had known her, the expression looked genuinely amused rather than simply polite. "Maria, I'm 78 years old, and I live in a nursing home. How dramatic could I possibly be?" Before Maria could respond, the sound of vehicles pulling into the parking lot drew both women's attention to the window. 3 black SUVs had arrived in formation, their windows tinted dark enough to obscure the occupants. The vehicles weren't unusual in themselves. Family members and medical specialists often arrived in expensive cars, but there was something about the precision of their parking and the coordinated way they'd entered the lot that suggested organization beyond what most civilian visits required. Dorothy's posture didn't change, but Maria noticed that her hands had shifted slightly in her lap, her fingers now positioned in a way that suggested readiness rather than relaxation. It was a subtle change, the kind that most people would miss entirely, but Maria had spent enough time observing Dorothy to recognize when her behavior pattern shifted. "Are you expecting visitors, Mrs. Miller?" Maria asked. "Not exactly expecting," Dorothy replied, her eyes now fixed entirely on the SUVs. "But not entirely surprised either." The doors of the lead vehicle opened, and 4 men emerged with movements that were too coordinated to be accidental. They were dressed in civilian clothes, dark suits that looked expensive but practical, and they moved with the kind of fluid efficiency that suggested extensive training in environments where mistakes had serious consequences. The men weren't large or intimidating in an obvious way, but there was something about their awareness of their surroundings and their positioning relative to each other that made them seem more significant than their appearance suggested. Maria felt her pulse quicken slightly as she watched the men approach the building's main entrance. "Mrs. Miller, do you know who those men are?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that Maria had never heard before. "They're people who take certain responsibilities very seriously." The automatic doors at Sunrise Manor's main entrance opened as the 4 men entered the building. The lobby was designed to be welcoming and comfortable, with soft lighting and furniture arranged to encourage conversation between residents and their families. But the men who entered didn't look like they were there for a social visit. They moved through the space with purpose, their eyes scanning the environment in a pattern that suggested professional assessment rather than casual observation. Tommy Rivera, the young maintenance worker who'd been replacing light bulbs in the lobby, stopped what he was doing and watched the men with the kind of fascination that people display when they encounter something they can't quite categorize. Tommy was 22 years old and had been working at Sunrise Manor for 8 months. In that time, he'd seen every type of visitor that nursing homes typically received. These men didn't fit any of the usual categories. The lead man approached the reception desk, where Jessica Brooks, Walsh's assistant administrator, was reviewing the morning schedule. Jessica looked up from her computer screen with the practiced smile that she used for all visitors, but Maria noticed from across the room that the smile faltered slightly when she made eye contact with the man. "Good morning," the man said, his voice carrying the kind of polite authority that people use when they expect to be taken seriously. "We're here to see Dorothy Miller." Jessica's fingers paused over her keyboard, and she glanced toward the common room where Dorothy and Maria were still seated by the window. "Are you family members? I'll need to check our visitor log and see if Mrs. Miller is available for visits this morning." The man reached into his jacket and produced identification that he held just long enough for Jessica to read before returning it to his pocket. Maria couldn't see what the identification said from across the room, but she watched Jessica's expression change from polite professionalism to something that looked like nervous concern. "I see," Jessica said, her voice now carrying a slight tremor. Let me contact Mr. Walsh immediately. He'll want to speak with you personally." "That won't be necessary," the man replied. "We're here specifically to see Mrs. Miller. This is a routine welfare check based on a communication we received." Dorothy stood up from her table with the kind of smooth, controlled movement that suggested strength and flexibility that most people her age had lost decades earlier. She walked toward the lobby, with Maria following a few steps behind, uncertain about what was happening but feeling protective of the elderly woman who'd become one of her favorite residents. As Dorothy approached the group of men, Maria watched their body language change in subtle but unmistakable ways. They straightened slightly, their positioning shifted to something that looked more formal, and the lead man's expression took on a quality that suggested recognition and respect, rather than the condescending patience that most people used when dealing with elderly nursing home residents. "Ma'am," the lead man said when Dorothy reached the group. His tone was respectful in a way that seemed genuine rather than perfunctory. "We received your communication. Are you in immediate danger?" Dorothy glanced around the lobby, taking note of Jessica's pale complexion, Tommy's fascinated stare, and Maria's confused concern. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear, carrying an authority that seemed to transform the space around her. "The situation is developing," she said, "but I'm not in immediate physical danger. The threat is administrative and potentially financial." The man nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense to him, though Maria couldn't understand how an administrative threat could warrant a visit from men who looked like they belonged in action movies rather than nursing homes. "Do you require immediate extraction, or would you prefer that we address the situation through other channels?" "Other channels would be appropriate at this time," Dorothy replied. "But I wanted assets in position in case the situation escalates." Maria felt as though she were listening to a conversation in a foreign language that she almost, but not quite understood. The words were English, but the context and implications were beyond her experience. She looked back and forth between Dorothy and the men, trying to process how a 78-year-old woman in a cardigan was discussing, quote, assets and extraction, with people who apparently took her seriously enough to drive 4 hours in response to her message. Jessica Brooks had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm, and she finally interrupted with the kind of nervous authority that people use when they're trying to regain control of situations that have moved beyond their understanding. "Excuse me," she said, her voice pitched higher than usual. "I really do need to contact Mr. Walsh about this visit. We have policies about unscheduled visitors, and I'm not sure what kind of situation you're referring to." The lead man turned his attention to Jessica with the kind of patient politeness that somehow managed to be more intimidating than outright hostility. "Ma'am, we're conducting a welfare check on a person under our protection. No facility policies are being violated, and no additional approvals are required." "Under your protection?" Jessica repeated, her confusion evident. "I don't understand." "Mrs. Miller is a resident here. She's not under anyone's protection, except the facility's standard care." Dorothy stepped forward slightly, and when she spoke, her voice carried a tone that Maria had never heard from her before. It wasn't loud or harsh, but it had a quality of command that made everyone in the lobby pay attention. "Jessica," Dorothy said, "perhaps you should contact Mr. Walsh and inform him that I have visitors. I'm sure he'll want to discuss my situation with them personally." There was something in Dorothy's suggestion that sounded more like an instruction than a request, and Jessica nodded quickly before hurrying toward the administrative offices. As she disappeared down the hallway, Maria heard her calling Walsh's name, with the kind of urgency that suggested she viewed the situation as above her authority level. Tommy Rivera had abandoned his maintenance work entirely and was watching the scene unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing something unprecedented. He'd grown fond of Dorothy during his months at Sunrise Manor, appreciating her quiet kindness and the way she never treated him like he was invisible, the way some residents did with the maintenance staff. Seeing her interact with these serious men was like discovering that someone he thought he knew was actually a character from a movie. "Mrs. Miller," Tommy said, approaching the group with the kind of tentative courage that young people sometimes display when they're not sure if they should get involved in adult situations. "Are you okay? Do you need me to call someone?" Dorothy's expression softened when she looked at Tommy, and Maria could see genuine affection in her eyes. "I'm fine, Tommy. These gentlemen are here to help me with a problem I'm having with Mr. Walsh." "The eviction thing?" Tommy asked, his face flushing slightly as he realized he'd been listening to conversations that weren't meant for him. "I heard about that. It's not right what he's doing to you." One of the men who hadn't spoken yet turned his attention to Tommy with interest. "What eviction?" Tommy glanced at Dorothy, who nodded slightly as if giving him permission to continue. "Mr. Walsh gave Mrs. Miller a notice yesterday. Said she has to leave in 30 days because she's too independent and doesn't need enough medical care to justify her bed." The men exchanged glances that suggested this information was significant in ways that Tommy couldn't understand. The lead man pulled out a small device that looked like a high-end smartphone and typed a brief message before returning it to his pocket. "Ma'am," he said to Dorothy, "this changes the parameters of our assessment. Administrative harassment of protected persons falls under different protocols than the welfare check we were expecting to conduct." Dorothy nodded, as if this statement made perfect sense to her. "I thought it might. How would you like to proceed?" Before the man could answer, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed from the administrative hallway, and Brandon Walsh appeared with Jessica Brooks close behind him. Walsh was moving faster than his usual measured pace, and his carefully maintained composure showed signs of strain that suggested Jessica had conveyed the seriousness of the situation. Walsh approached the group with the kind of aggressive confidence that people use when they're trying to establish dominance in situations where they feel uncertain. He looked at the four men with obvious suspicion, then turned his attention to Dorothy with an expression that mixed irritation with bewilderment. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice carrying the condescending tone he used when he wanted residents to remember their place in the facility's hierarchy. "I understand you have visitors this morning. I wasn't aware that you'd invited anyone to discuss your housing situation." Dorothy met Walsh's gaze with steady calm. "Mr. Walsh, I'd like you to meet some friends of mine. They heard about my situation and wanted to make sure I was being treated appropriately." Walsh looked at the men again, this time trying to assess whether they represented legal threat or simply family members who might cause public relations problems for the facility. "And you are?" The lead man stepped forward slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that made it clear he wasn't asking for Walsh's approval or permission for anything. "We're representatives of an organization that takes a special interest in the welfare of certain individuals," he said. "We understand that Mrs. Miller has been given notice to vacate the premises. We'd like to discuss the circumstances of that decision." Walsh's eyebrows rose, and his expression took on the kind of patronizing patience that he used when dealing with family members who thought they could interfere with his administrative decisions. "I'm sorry, but resident housing decisions are internal facility matters. Unless you're legal representatives or family members with documented authority, I can't discuss Mrs. Miller's situation with you." The man reached into his jacket again and produced a different piece of identification, holding it at an angle that allowed Walsh to read it while keeping it concealed from the other observers. Maria watched Walsh's face change as he processed whatever information the identification contained. His complexion paled slightly, and his confident posture shifted to something that looked more defensive. I see, Walsh said, his voice now carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. Perhaps we should discuss this in my office. That would be appropriate, the man agreed. Mrs. Miller, would you like to accompany us? Dorothy nodded, and as the group moved toward the administrative offices, Maria noticed that the other residents in the common room had stopped their activities and were watching the procession with the kind of intense curiosity that people display when they sense that something significant is happening, even if they can't understand what it is. Frank Chen, an 81-year-old Korean War veteran who'd been reading a newspaper at a nearby table, looked up as Dorothy passed and caught her eye. There was something in his expression that suggested recognition, not of her specifically, but of a type of person he'd encountered before in circumstances that had nothing to do with nursing homes. "Give them hell, Dorothy," he said quietly, and Dorothy smiled at him with the kind of warmth that suggested shared understanding. As Walsh's office door closed behind the group, the lobby of Sunrise Manor fell into the kind of charged silence that follows significant events. Maria stood by the reception desk, trying to process what she'd witnessed, and failing to find a framework that made sense of Dorothy Miller's transformation from quiet nursing home resident to someone who could summon men in black SUVs with a single message. Tommy Rivera approached Maria with the kind of excited energy that young people display when they've witnessed something that exceeds their normal experience. "Maria, did you see that? Mrs. Miller just walked into Walsh's office like she owned the place. And those guys, they weren't treating her like some old lady they had to be polite to. They were treating her like she was their boss or something." Maria nodded slowly, remembering the way Dorothy's posture had changed when the men arrived, the authority in her voice when she'd given Jessica instructions, and the confidence with which she'd accepted the men's offer to discuss her situation with Walsh. "Tommy," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I don't think we know Dorothy Miller as well as we thought we did." Through the closed door of Walsh's office, the sound of voices could be heard, though the words were too muffled to understand, but the tone was clear enough. Walsh was doing most of the talking, and his voice carried the kind of defensive explanations that people use when they're trying to justify decisions that have suddenly become more complicated than they'd anticipated. The other voice that could be heard belonged to the lead man, and his contributions to the conversation were brief, measured, and carried the weight of someone who was accustomed to having his questions answered completely and honestly. In the common room, other residents had begun to gather near the administrative hallway, not close enough to eavesdrop, but positioned to observe whatever emerged from Walsh's office. The atmosphere had taken on the quality of anticipation that precedes revelations that change everyone's understanding of situations they thought they comprehended. Dorothy Miller sat in Brandon Walsh's office, surrounded by men who treated her with the kind of professional respect that she hadn't experienced in years, and for the first time since receiving her eviction notice, she felt the familiar satisfaction that came from watching opponents realize they'd seriously underestimated both the situation and the person they were dealing with. Outside Walsh's office, the morning shift at Sunrise Manor continued with its usual routines, but everyone who'd witnessed Dorothy's transformation understood that something fundamental had changed. The quiet elderly woman, who helped with crossword puzzles and reminded people to take their medication, had somehow become the center of a situation that involved men in black SUVs and conversations about protection protocols. And in the back of everyone's mind was the growing realization that Dorothy Miller might be someone entirely different from who they'd thought she was for the past 6 months. Someone whose story was far more complex and significant than anyone at Sunrise Manor had imagined. Word spread through Sunrise Manor with the peculiar velocity that information achieves in closed communities, where routine is everything, and deviation becomes the most compelling form of entertainment. Within an hour of Dorothy Miller's meeting with the men in black SUVs, every resident, staff member, and visitor seemed to know that something unprecedented was unfolding in Brandon Walsh's office. The ripple effect began with whispered conversations between residents who'd witnessed the morning's events. Mrs. Patterson, who usually spent her days working on crossword puzzles with Dorothy's patient assistants, found herself at the center of attention for the first time since arriving at Sunrise Manor. Other residents gathered around her table in the common room, hungry for details about the woman they'd lived alongside for 6 months without truly knowing. She was different this morning, Mrs. Patterson told the growing circle of listeners, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd actually interacted with Dorothy regularly. Not unfriendly, but focused. Like she was waiting for something important to happen. Harold Winters, a retired insurance salesman who prided himself on reading people accurately, leaned forward in his wheelchair with the intensity of someone who'd discovered a puzzle worth solving. I always thought there was something unusual about her. The way she carries herself, you know? Most people our age, we've gotten comfortable with being a little slower, a little less aware of our surroundings. But Dorothy always seemed like she was still expecting trouble. Agnes Martinez, whose arthritis usually kept her confined to her room during morning hours, had made a rare appearance in the common room specifically to participate in the speculation about Dorothy's mysterious visitors. "My nephew works for the county sheriff's department," she said, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial whisper that people use when sharing information they're not entirely certain they should possess. "He told me that federal agents sometimes drive vehicles like those black SUVs. The kind with special government plates and communications equipment." The suggestion that Dorothy might be connected to federal law enforcement sent a new wave of excitement through the group. Residents who'd barely noticed her quiet presence began recounting every interaction they'd had with her, searching for clues they might have missed about her true identity or background. Frank Chen, the Korean War veteran who'd encouraged Dorothy as she'd walked toward Walsh's office, listened to the speculation with a kind of patient attention that suggested he was processing information rather than simply satisfying curiosity. Frank had been a reconnaissance specialist during his military service, and his experience with classified operations had taught him to recognize certain behavioral patterns that civilians missed entirely. "She's not law enforcement," he said finally, his voice carrying enough conviction to quiet the other conversations. "Law enforcement officers, even retired ones, they carry themselves differently. They're used to showing authority, to making sure people know they're in charge. Dorothy's got the awareness and the discipline, but she's used to staying invisible." The group turned their attention to Frank, recognizing that his military background might provide insights that their civilian perspectives couldn't offer. "So what do you think she is?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Frank was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap, as he considered how much of his suspicion he should share with people who might not understand the implications. "In the military, we sometimes worked with people who weren't officially part of our unit, specialists who came in for specific missions, did their job, and disappeared again. They had the same kind of quiet competence that Dorothy shows, the same way of watching everything without appearing to pay attention to anything." "You mean like spies?" Agnes asked, her eyes widening with the thrill of the possibility. "Not spies exactly," Frank replied. "More like operators. People who did work that required them to blend into civilian populations. The kind of people who could be sitting next to you on a bus or working in the office next to yours, and you'd never know they could take apart a rifle blindfolded or navigate through hostile territory using nothing but a compass and their memory." The speculation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patricia Hayes, Sunrise Manor's staff physician, who'd been called in to evaluate whether Dorothy's morning excitement might require medical attention. Dr. Hayes was a woman in her mid-50s who'd chosen geriatric medicine because she genuinely enjoyed working with elderly patients, and she'd developed a reputation for treating residents with dignity and respect, rather than the condescending patience that some medical professionals used with aging populations. "Has anyone actually seen Mrs. Miller since she went into Mr. Walsh's office?" Dr. Hayes asked, her tone carrying professional concern rather than idle curiosity. Maria Santos, who'd been hovering near the administrative hallway for the past hour, turned to address the doctor. "The door's been closed the whole time. We can hear voices, but we can't make out what they're saying. Mr. Walsh sounds agitated." Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. She'd had her own professional conflicts with Walsh over his tendency to prioritize cost savings over resident care, and she was genuinely concerned about how the morning stress might affect Dorothy's health. "I'd like to check on her when the meeting concludes. This kind of situation can be very taxing for someone her age. Tommy Rivera, who'd been listening to the residents' speculation while pretending to continue his maintenance work, finally approached the group with the kind of nervous energy that comes from having information that others want, but being uncertain about sharing it. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only the immediate group could hear him. "I don't think Mrs. Miller is as fragile as most people think she is." The doctor turned her attention to Tommy with interest. As the facility's maintenance worker, Tommy had access to areas and situations that other staff members didn't encounter, and his observations sometimes provided insights that formal medical evaluations missed. "What do you mean, Tommy?" Dr. Hayes asked. Tommy glanced around the group, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but feeling compelled to share what he'd observed. "I've been working here for 8 months, and I've seen how most residents handle stress and change. They get anxious or confused, or they need extra medication to help them cope. But this morning, when those men arrived, and when she found out they were here for her, Mrs. Miller didn't look stressed at all. She looked ready." "Ready for what?" Maria asked. "That's what I can't figure out," Tommy admitted. But whatever it was, she'd been expecting it. Not those specific men, maybe, but something, like she'd been waiting for someone to show up who understood who she really was. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Walsh's office door opening. The group in the common room fell silent as they watched 4 figures emerge from the administrative hallway. Dorothy walked between 2 of the men in a formation that looked protective rather than escorted, while the other 2 flanked Walsh, who appeared pale and considerably less confident than he'd been when entering his own office an hour earlier. Dorothy's posture had undergone another subtle transformation during the meeting. Where she'd carried herself with quiet dignity during her months at Sunrise Manor, she now moved with the kind of controlled precision that suggested someone accustomed to environments where every step might be significant. Her expression was calm but alert, and when she scanned the common room, her gaze lingered on each person present long enough to assess their emotional state and potential reactions. Walsh, by contrast, looked like a man who'd just discovered that a situation he'd thought he controlled had parameters he'd never considered. His usual polished confidence had been replaced by the kind of careful behavior that people display when they're trying not to make mistakes that might have serious consequences. The lead man, who'd identified himself as Dorothy's representative, approached the group of residents and staff with the same respectful authority he'd shown throughout the morning. When he spoke, his voice carried enough volume to address everyone present without sounding like he was making a public announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we've concluded our discussion with Mr. Walsh about Mrs. Miller's housing situation. We want to assure everyone that Mrs. Miller's residency at Sunrise Manor will continue without interruption, and that she'll receive the respect and care that she deserves." The statement was simple and direct, but its implications rippled through the group like stones dropped in still water. Walsh's eviction notice had been overturned by men whose authority apparently superseded his own, and Dorothy Miller had somehow arranged for this intervention with a single message sent through channels that none of them understood. Mrs. Patterson was the first to break the silence that followed the man's announcement. "Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of amazement and gratitude, "I don't know who you really are, but I'm very glad you're staying with us." Dorothy's expression softened as she looked at the elderly woman who'd become one of her few genuine friends at Sunrise Manor. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I'm glad to be staying, too." Frank Chen wheeled his chair closer to Dorothy, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of recognition that passes between people who've shared experiences that others can't understand. "Ma'am," he said, using the formal address that military personnel employed when showing respect to someone whose rank or service they acknowledged, "it's an honor to have you here." Dorothy met Frank's gaze and nodded once, a gesture that seemed to communicate understanding and mutual respect without requiring additional explanation. "The honor is mine, Frank." Dr. Hayes approached Dorothy with professional concern, but her demeanor carried a new element of curiosity that hadn't been present in her previous interactions with the elderly woman. "Mrs. Miller, I'd like to check your blood pressure and heart rate after this morning's excitement. This kind of situation can be very stressful." "That's very thoughtful of you, Dr. Hayes," Dorothy replied, "but I'm feeling quite well. This morning has been clarifying rather than stressful." The men who'd accompanied Dorothy began moving toward the exit, their mission apparently complete. The lead man paused near Dorothy and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear his words, though everyone present could observe the exchange. "Ma'am," he said, "the communication channel remains open. If your situation changes, or if you require additional assistance, don't hesitate to reach out." Dorothy nodded. "Thank you. Please give my regards to Admiral Torres." The mention of an admiral's name sent another wave of speculation through the observers. But before anyone could process the implications fully, the men had exited the building and were walking toward their vehicles with the same coordinated precision they'd displayed upon arrival. Walsh remained standing near the administrative hallway, looking like someone who'd just survived an experience that had fundamentally altered his understanding of his own authority and limitations. When Maria approached him to ask about Dorothy's status, his response was uncharacteristically brief and deferential. "Mrs. Gettore, Miller's residency will continue indefinitely," he said, his voice lacking the condescending confidence that usually characterized his interactions with staff. "Please ensure that she receives whatever accommodations or assistance she requires." As the black SUVs pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared down the tree-lined street that led away from Sunrise Manor, the staff and residents began to process what they'd witnessed and what it meant for their understanding of Dorothy Miller and their own small community. Tommy Rivera found himself standing next to Maria Santos, near the window where Dorothy had been sitting when the morning's events began. "Maria," he said, his voice filled with the kind of wonder that comes from discovering that ordinary situations can contain extraordinary elements, "do you think we'll ever find out who she really is?" Maria watched Dorothy settling back into her usual chair, pulling out the worn paperback novel she'd been reading, and resuming the quiet routine that had characterized her life at Sunrise Manor for the past 6 months. "I think," Maria said slowly, "that we just found out exactly who she is. We just don't understand what it means yet." The afternoon shift change brought new staff members who hadn't witnessed the morning's events, but who quickly became aware that something significant had occurred. Nancy Williams, the afternoon charge nurse, arrived to find the entire facility buzzing with energy and speculation that was entirely different from the usual calm routine that characterized life at Sunrise Manor. "What's going on here?" Nancy asked Maria as they completed their shift transition report. "Everyone looks like they've seen a celebrity or something." Maria glanced toward the common room where Dorothy was reading her book while surrounded by other residents who were clearly hoping for additional revelations about her mysterious morning visitors. "Nancy, you know Mrs. Miller in room 247? The quiet woman who helps everyone with their activities?" "Of course," Nancy replied. "Sweet lady. Very helpful. Never causes any problems." "This morning she caused the biggest problem Brandon Walsh has ever encountered," Maria said, and then she solved it with a single phone call that brought federal agents to the facility within hours. Nancy's eyebrows rose. "Federal agents? Here? What kind of trouble is Mrs. Miller in?" "That's what we're all trying to figure out," Maria admitted. "But I don't think she's in trouble. I think she's the kind of person who has resources we never knew existed, and this morning Walsh found out what happens when you try to push around someone who has those kinds of resources." The story of Dorothy's morning transformation spread beyond Sunrise Manor, through the network of families, friends, and professional contacts that connected the facility to the broader community of Cedar Falls. By evening, speculation about the mysterious elderly woman and her government connections had reached local law enforcement, city officials, and members of the veterans organizations that served the area's retired military population. Detective Ray Morrison of the Cedar Falls Police Department received a call from his mother, who volunteered at a senior center across town, and had heard about the morning's events through the informal communication network that connected the area's elderly care facilities. Detective Morrison's mother was convinced that Dorothy Miller was either a witness in a federal investigation or a former government employee whose identity had been compromised, and she wanted her son to use his law enforcement connections to verify that the situation was being handled appropriately. "Mom," Detective Morrison said patiently, "if federal agents were involved, then it's being handled by people with more authority and better resources than the Cedar Falls Police Department. Whatever this woman's situation is, it's above our jurisdiction." But Detective Morrison's curiosity was piqued, despite his professional caution, and he made a discreet inquiry through law enforcement channels about unusual federal activity in the area. The response he received was polite but firm. No information was available about ongoing federal operations, and local law enforcement was advised to avoid any interference with activities that might be related to national security matters. The response told Detective Morrison two important things. Federal agents had indeed been active in Cedar Falls that morning, and whatever Dorothy Miller's situation involved, it was classified at a level that made local law enforcement inquiries unwelcome. At Sunrise Manor, the evening shift found residents and staff still processing the day's revelations. Dorothy had returned to her usual activities, helping Mrs. Patterson with a particularly challenging crossword puzzle and reminding Mr. Jenkins to take his evening medications. But her interactions carried a new quality of attention from others, as if everyone present was trying to reconcile the quiet, helpful woman they'd known with the person who could summon federal agents with a single message. Frank Chen approached Dorothy during the evening social hour, when residents typically gathered in the common room to watch television or play card games. "Mrs. Miller," he said quietly, "I hope you don't mind me saying so, but this morning reminded me of some experiences I had during my military service, working with people who had capabilities and resources that weren't officially acknowledged." Dorothy looked up from the magazine she'd been reading, and her expression showed genuine interest in Frank's observation. "What kind of experiences, Frank?" "Reconnaissance missions mostly," Frank replied, settling into a nearby chair. "Sometimes we'd work with specialists who weren't part of our regular unit. They'd show up when we needed specific kinds of expertise, do their job, and disappear again. We were told not to ask questions about who they were or where they came from." Dorothy nodded thoughtfully. "That must have been challenging. Working with people you couldn't fully understand or trust." "Actually, it wasn't," Frank said, "because even though we didn't know their backgrounds, we could see their competence. The way they moved, the way they assessed situations, the way they handled equipment and made decisions under pressure. You learn to recognize professionalism even when you don't understand the context." "And what did you recognize this morning?" Dorothy asked. Frank smiled, and his expression carried the warmth of mutual understanding between people who'd shared similar experiences in very different contexts. "I recognized someone who'd earned the right to call for help when she needed it. And I recognized people who responded because they respected what she'd done to earn that right." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of gratitude that seemed to encompass more than just Frank's understanding of the morning's events. "Thank you, Frank. It means a great deal to have someone understand that sometimes the most important work happens in ways that can't be publicly acknowledged." As the evening progressed and residents began returning to their rooms for the night, Dorothy found herself reflecting on the day's events and their implications for her life at Sunrise Manor. The intervention she'd requested had accomplished its immediate purpose. Her eviction notice had been canceled, and Walsh would no longer view her as a problem to be solved through administrative convenience. But the morning's revelations had also changed her relationship with the community she'd been trying to build at Sunrise Manor. The other residents and staff now knew that she was someone other than the quiet, helpful woman they'd thought they understood, and that knowledge would affect every future interaction in ways that were difficult to predict. Dorothy had spent the years since her retirement learning to live as a civilian, developing relationships based on her current identity rather than her professional past. The balance between maintaining operational security and building genuine human connections had always been delicate, and this morning's events had shifted that balance in ways that would require careful navigation. As she prepared for bed in her small room, Dorothy reflected on the photograph that sat on her nightstand, showing 4 women in hiking gear who'd been so much more than the casual outdoor enthusiasts they appeared to be. The mission that had cost 3 of those women their lives had been classified so deeply that their sacrifice would never be publicly acknowledged, but their memory continued to influence Dorothy's decisions and priorities more than a decade after their deaths. The pendant she'd used to call for help that morning had been a gift from Sarah Kim, who'd insisted that retired operators needed ways to reach active teams when civilian resources proved inadequate. Sarah had died believing that the network of current and former operators represented a family that transcended official military structures, and that family members looked after each other regardless of time or distance. This morning had proven Sarah's belief correct, and Dorothy felt a mixture of gratitude and responsibility that came from being part of something larger than her individual circumstances. The men who'd responded to her call hadn't known the details of her situation, but they'd trusted that her request for assistance was legitimate, and that her service had earned her the right to that assistance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she navigated the changed dynamics at Sunrise Manor, but tonight Dorothy Miller fell asleep knowing that she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who'd begun to understand that her quiet presence represented something more significant than they'd initially realized, protected by a network of professionals who honored the service of those who'd served before them, and secure in the knowledge that some bonds of loyalty and mutual support transcended the normal boundaries of civilian life. The morning's events had reminded everyone at Sunrise Manor that ordinary-looking people sometimes carried extraordinary histories, and that the assumptions they made about their neighbors and community members might be far less accurate than they'd believed. For Dorothy Miller, the day had proven that retirement from active service didn't mean abandonment by the community that had shaped her professional life, and that the quiet dignity she'd cultivated as a civilian could coexist with the resources and respect she'd earned as an operator. The ripple effects of those revelations would continue to spread through the community of Cedar Falls and beyond, touching the lives of people who'd never heard of Dorothy Miller, but who benefited from the ongoing work of the networks and organizations that had responded to her call for help. Because sometimes the most important victories were the ones that prevented larger conflicts from developing, and sometimes the most valuable service was rendered by people whose names would never appear in official records or public recognition. The weeks following Dorothy Miller's confrontation with Brandon Walsh brought a period of uneasy adjustment to Sunrise Manor. Walsh had resumed his administrative duties with the kind of forced normalcy that people adopt when they're trying to pretend that life-altering events haven't fundamentally changed their understanding of their own authority and limitations. But his interactions with Dorothy carried a new quality of cautious respect that everyone noticed, even if they couldn't fully explain the transformation. Walsh's attempts to reassert his control over the facility's operations took on an increasingly desperate quality as he discovered that his authority had been undermined in ways that extended far beyond Dorothy's individual situation. The intervention by federal agents had raised questions among the facility's board of directors about Walsh's judgment and management practices, particularly regarding his treatment of residents who might have connections or resources that weren't immediately apparent. Dr. Patricia Hayes found herself fielding inquiries from board members who wanted to understand how a routine administrative decision had escalated into a situation requiring federal intervention. The questions revealed that the board knew far less about the morning's events than they'd initially claimed, and that Walsh's explanation of the situation had been incomplete and potentially misleading. Dr. Hayes, board chairman Robert Sterling, said during a private conversation that took place in the facility's conference room, "We need to understand exactly what happened with Mrs. Miller's housing situation. The version we received from Mr. Walsh suggests that there was some kind of misunderstanding about her eligibility for continued residency, but the involvement of federal agents implies that the situation was more complex than a simple administrative review." Dr. Hayes chose her words carefully, aware that her response might affect not only Walsh's position, but also Dorothy's privacy and security. "Mr. Sterling, what I can tell you is that Mrs. Miller appears to have connections to government agencies that weren't apparent from her admission paperwork. When Mr. Walsh issued her eviction notice, she contacted people who had the authority to review and overturn his decision. "What kind of connections?" Sterling asked, his tone suggesting that he was trying to assess potential liability for the facility. "The kind that suggest Mrs. Miller's background includes service to her country in ways that earned her ongoing protection and support," Dr. Hayes replied. "Beyond that, I think any additional details would need to come from Mrs. Miller herself if she chooses to share them." Sterling nodded slowly, processing the implications of having a resident whose background included classified government service. "Dr. Hayes, in your professional opinion, does Mrs. Miller's presence at our facility create any security risks or administrative complications that we should be aware of?" "In my opinion," Dr. Hayes said, "Mrs. Miller represents the kind of resident that any facility should be honored to serve. She's helpful, respectful, and requires minimal medical intervention." The only complication arose when Mr. Walsh decided that those qualities made her unsuitable for continued residency. The conversation reflected a broader shift in how Sunrise Manor's leadership viewed both Dorothy's presence and Walsh's judgment. The realization that their facility housed someone with connections to federal agencies had forced them to reconsider their assumptions about resident backgrounds and the potential consequences of administrative decisions that seemed routine on the surface. Meanwhile, Dorothy had begun to notice subtle changes in how other residents and staff members interacted with her. The transformation wasn't dramatic or unwelcome, but it reflected a new awareness that she was someone whose story extended far beyond her current circumstances. Mrs. Patterson continued to ask for help with crossword puzzles, but their conversations now included questions about Dorothy's travels and experiences that suggested curiosity about her past. Frank Chan had become a regular companion during evening social hours, and their discussions carried the easy familiarity of people who'd shared similar professional experiences in very different contexts. Tommy Rivera had grown increasingly bold in expressing his fascination with Dorothy's mysterious background, and his questions reflected a young person's romanticized view of government service and classified operations. Dorothy handled his curiosity with patient humor, sharing stories about her civilian life and interests, while deflecting inquiries about her professional past, with the kind of gentle redirection that protected both operational security and Tommy's feelings. "Mrs. Miller," Tommy said one afternoon while repairing a loose handrail near Dorothy's favorite reading spot, "do you think I could ever do the kind of work you used to do? I mean, assuming you did the kind of work I think you did." Dorothy looked up from her magazine with the kind of thoughtful expression that suggested she was considering how to respond honestly without revealing information that should remain classified. "Tommy, what kind of work do you think would be most meaningful to you?" "I want to do something that matters," Tommy said, his voice carrying the earnest intensity that young people bring to discussions about their future. "Something that helps protect people who can't protect themselves. Something that makes a difference, even if nobody ever knows about it." Dorothy's expression softened with genuine warmth. "Those are admirable goals, Tommy. There are many ways to serve your country and protect people who need help. Some of those ways involve military service, some involve law enforcement, some involve medical care, or education, or social work. The most important thing is finding the path that matches your abilities and interests." "But how do you know if you're tough enough for the really dangerous stuff?" Tommy asked, his curiosity overriding his usual politeness. "How do you know if you have what it takes to do the jobs that nobody talks about?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of experience and loss that had shaped her understanding of service and sacrifice. "Tommy, the people who do the most dangerous work aren't necessarily the ones who think they're tough enough. They're usually the ones who care enough about protecting others that they're willing to accept whatever risks are necessary to get the job done." "Did you ever get scared?" Tommy asked, his voice dropping to a whisper as if he were asking about something sacred. "Every day," Dorothy replied without hesitation. "Fear is what keeps you alive when you're doing dangerous work. The trick is learning to function effectively while you're scared, not learning to stop being scared." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Maria Santos, who'd been looking for Dorothy to discuss a change in her medication schedule that Dr. Hayes had recommended. But Maria lingered after delivering her message, clearly interested in overhearing Dorothy's advice to Tommy about careers in dangerous government service. "Mrs. Miller," Maria said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but Tommy's questions got me thinking about something. My oldest daughter is studying criminal justice in college, and she's interested in federal law enforcement. Do you think that's a good career path for a young woman?" Dorothy's eyes showed genuine interest in Maria's daughter's ambitions. What draws her to federal law enforcement specifically? "She wants to work on cases that involve protecting children," Maria explained. "Human trafficking, online predators, that kind of thing. She says she wants to do work that saves lives, even if it means dealing with people who do terrible things." "Those are important missions," Dorothy said, "and they require people who can handle extremely difficult emotional and psychological challenges. If your daughter has the academic preparation and the emotional resilience for that kind of work, federal agencies need people with her motivation and values." "But is it safe?" Maria asked, her maternal concern evident in her voice. "I mean, I know law enforcement is always dangerous, but federal cases seem like they'd involve people who are more sophisticated in their criminal activities." Dorothy considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, aware that her response might influence a young woman's career decisions and a mother's peace of mind. "Maria, any career in law enforcement involves risks, and federal cases do sometimes involve highly organized criminal enterprises. But federal agencies also have better training, better equipment, and better support systems than most local law enforcement. If your daughter pursues that path, she'll receive preparation that will help her minimize risks and maximize her effectiveness." "Have you ever known women who did that kind of work?" Maria asked, her curiosity clearly extending beyond career advice for her daughter. "I've known many women who chose careers that required them to face dangerous situations in order to protect others," Dorothy replied. "Some of them worked in law enforcement, some in the military, some in intelligence agencies, some in diplomatic security. All of them found ways to contribute meaningfully to their country's safety while building rewarding professional lives." The conversation reflected the ongoing impact of Dorothy's revealed background on the Sunrise Manor community. Staff members and residents had begun to see her as a resource for advice and perspective on careers in government service, military life, and national security work. Her responses were always thoughtful and encouraging, but they carefully avoided specific details about her own experiences, while providing general guidance that reflected deep knowledge of how such careers actually functioned. Dr. Hayes had noticed the change in how people interacted with Dorothy, and she'd grown concerned that the elderly woman might feel pressured to serve as an informal counselor for people dealing with career decisions and family concerns that extended far beyond typical nursing home social dynamics. "Mrs. Miller, drive," Hayes said during one of their routine medical consultations. "I've noticed that people have been asking you a lot of questions about government service and federal careers. I hope you don't feel obligated to provide guidance on topics that might bring up difficult memories or compromise your privacy." Dorothy appreciated Dr. Hayes' concern, but her response reflected genuine enjoyment of her role as an informal mentor within the Sunrise Manor community. "Dr. Hayes, I'm grateful that people feel comfortable asking for my perspective. After spending most of my adult life in work that couldn't be discussed publicly, it's refreshing to be able to share general knowledge that might help young people make informed decisions about their futures. But doesn't it feel strange to have people speculating about your background and asking personal questions about experiences that were probably classified?" Dr. Hayes asked. "Actually," Dorothy said with a smile that suggested genuine amusement, "it feels normal. Throughout my career, I worked with people who knew that I had capabilities and experience that I couldn't discuss in detail. They learned to trust my judgment and accept my advice without requiring complete explanations of how I'd acquired that knowledge. The relationships I'm building here feel very similar, just in a different context." Dr. Hayes nodded, understanding that Dorothy's comfort with partial disclosure and implied expertise reflected professional habits that had served her well throughout her government career. "Is there anything you need from me or the facility to help you maintain the privacy you require while still being able to help people who ask for your guidance. I appreciate your concern, Dorothy replied, but I think the current balance works well. I can share general knowledge and perspective without revealing specific details that should remain classified. And people seem satisfied with that level of information. The conversation reflected a new equilibrium that had developed at Sunrise Manor in the weeks following Dorothy's confrontation with Walsh. Residents and staff had accepted that Dorothy's background included experiences and connections that she couldn't fully explain, but they'd also learned to value her presence and advice without requiring complete transparency about her past. Frank Chen had become Dorothy's closest confidant within the facility, and their friendship reflected the mutual understanding that develops between people who've served their country in roles that required them to carry secrets that others couldn't share. Their evening conversations covered topics ranging from military history to current events, to philosophical questions about duty, sacrifice, and the meaning of service after retirement. "Dorothy," Frank said one evening as they sat in the common room, watching the sunset through the large windows that overlooked the facility's grounds, "do you ever miss the work you used to do?" Dorothy considered the question with the thoughtfulness that characterized all of her responses to inquiries about her past. "I miss working with people who shared my commitment to protecting others. I miss the sense of purpose that came from knowing that the work we did prevented attacks and saved lives. But I don't miss the constant stress and the isolation that came with maintaining operational security." "Do you think you made the right decision to retire when you did?" Frank asked. "I think I retired at the right time for the wrong reasons," Dorothy replied, her voice carrying a note of sadness that suggested she was remembering painful circumstances. "I left because I'd lost people who were important to me, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing anyone else. But I stayed away too long, and I isolated myself more than was necessary or healthy." Frank nodded, understanding that Dorothy was referring to losses that had shaped her decision to leave government service. "What changed your mind about isolation?" "This place," Dorothy said, gesturing toward the common room where other residents were engaged in their evening activities. "These people. The realization that I could contribute to a community without putting anyone at risk. The understanding that experience and knowledge are only valuable if they're shared in ways that help others." Their conversation was overheard by Mrs. Patterson, who had been working on a crossword puzzle at a nearby table. "Dorothy," she said, looking up from her puzzle, "I don't understand most of what you and Frank discuss about your military experiences, but I want you to know that having you here has made this place feel more like a real community than just a facility where we happen to live." Dorothy's expression showed genuine appreciation for Mrs. Patterson's sentiment. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That means a great deal to me." "I think what I'm trying to say," Mrs. Patterson continued, "is that whatever you did before you came here, you're still doing important work now. You're helping all of us feel safer and more connected to each other." The observation reflected a broader truth about Dorothy's impact on the Sunrise Manor community. Her presence had created a sense of security and stability that extended beyond her individual relationships with residents and staff. People felt safer knowing that someone with her background and connections was part of their community, and they drew confidence from her calm competence in dealing with challenges and conflicts. Brandon Walsh had discovered this truth in the most direct way possible, when his attempt to evict Dorothy had resulted in federal intervention that undermined his authority and exposed his administrative practices to unwelcome scrutiny. The board of directors had completed their review of the incident and had concluded that Walsh's judgment and management style required closer oversight and guidance. "Mr. Walsh," board chairman Robert Sterling said during a formal performance review that took place 6 weeks after Dorothy's confrontation with federal agents, "we've completed our investigation of the events surrounding Mrs. Miller's housing situation, and we have concerns about the decision-making process that led to that crisis." Walsh sat across from Sterling and 2 other board members in the facility's conference room, trying to maintain his professional composure while knowing that his career at Sunrise Manor was probably ending. "I followed standard procedures for evaluating resident eligibility and care needs," he said, his voice carrying defensive undertones that undermined his attempt to project confidence. "Mr. Walsh," Sterling replied, Standard procedures include thorough background reviews and consultation with medical staff before making decisions that affect resident housing. Our investigation found that you issued Mrs. Miller's eviction notice without consulting Dr. Hayes or reviewing her complete admission file. Mrs. Miller appeared to be inappropriately placed for our facility's care model, Walsh said, repeating the justification he'd used throughout the review process. She required minimal medical supervision and could have been served more cost-effectively at a standard senior housing facility. Mr. Walsh, the second board member Janet Morrison interjected, cost-effectiveness cannot be the primary consideration in housing decisions that affect residents who've paid their fees and met their obligations. Moreover, your evaluation failed to consider that Mrs. Miller's independence and minimal care needs made her an ideal resident from both operational and financial perspectives. The third board member, Dr. Michael Chang, leaned forward with the kind of serious expression that suggested he was delivering the most important part of the review. Mr. Walsh, our investigation also revealed that Mrs. Miller's background includes government service that earned her ongoing protection and support from federal agencies. Your decision to issue an eviction notice without understanding her complete background created a situation that could have exposed the facility to legal liability and public relations complications. Walsh's face flushed as he realized that the board's investigation had uncovered information about Dorothy's background that he'd never discovered during his months of observing her and planning her removal. I had no way of knowing about any government connections. Her admission paperwork showed standard civilian references and insurance coverage. That's precisely the problem, Sterling said, his tone carrying the authority of someone delivering a final judgment. Your evaluation process was superficial and failed to identify important information about a resident's background and support systems. That kind of oversight could have resulted in similar problems with other residents whose backgrounds include elements that aren't immediately apparent. The performance review concluded with Walsh's termination and the appointment of an interim administrator who would work with the board to develop more comprehensive procedures for resident evaluation and care planning. The changes reflected lessons learned from Dorothy's case about the importance of understanding residents as complete individuals rather than simply medical and financial profiles. News of Walsh's termination spread through Sunrise Manor with the same speed that had characterized the initial speculation about Dorothy's mysterious background. Residents and staff who'd witnessed Walsh's condescending treatment of Dorothy and other residents felt a sense of satisfaction that his administrative practices had finally resulted in consequences. Tommy Rivera heard about Walsh's firing from Maria Santos, who'd learned about it from Dr. Hayes during the afternoon shift change. Mrs. Miller probably doesn't even know yet, Tommy said, his voice carrying excitement about sharing news that he knew Dorothy would find meaningful. Tommy, Maria cautioned, we should let Mrs. Miller hear about this through official channels rather than facility gossip. This kind of personnel change affects everyone here, and she deserves to receive accurate information rather than rumors. But Tommy's enthusiasm for sharing good news with someone he'd come to admire overcame his usual respect for proper communication channels. He found Dorothy in the facility's small library, reading a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that she'd borrowed from the collection of books donated by residents' families. Mrs. Miller, Tommy said, his voice carrying barely suppressed excitement, I heard something today that I thought you'd want to know about. Dorothy looked up from her book with the kind of patient attention that she gave to all of Tommy's announcements, whether they concerned facility maintenance issues or his theories about her mysterious government background. What did you hear, Tommy? Brandon Walsh got fired, Tommy said, unable to contain his satisfaction with this development. The board completed their investigation of what happened with your eviction notice, and they decided that he didn't follow proper procedures. He's been terminated, and they're bringing in someone new to run the facility. Dorothy's expression showed genuine surprise at the news, followed by what appeared to be concern rather than satisfaction. That's quite a significant change for the facility. Do you know anything about his replacement? Tommy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly as he realized that Dorothy's reaction wasn't entirely positive. Maria said they're bringing in an interim administrator while they search for someone permanent. Why don't you seem happy about this? I thought you'd be glad that he can't try to evict you again. Dorothy closed her book and gave Tommy her complete attention, recognizing that his question reflected genuine confusion about her response to news that he'd expected would please her. "Tommy, I'm grateful that the situation has been resolved, but I don't take any satisfaction in seeing someone lose their job. Mr. Walsh made some poor decisions, but he also has responsibilities and obligations that will be affected by his termination." "But he was mean to you," Tommy protested, his sense of justice conflicting with Dorothy's measured response. "He tried to throw you out of your home just because you didn't cost the facility enough money in medical care." "You're right that his decision was unfair and poorly reasoned," Dorothy agreed. "But the purpose of addressing that decision was to correct the immediate problem, not to punish Mr. Walsh personally. Sometimes the consequences of our actions extend beyond what we intended, and those consequences can affect not just ourselves, but also our families and communities." Tommy considered Dorothy's perspective with the seriousness that he brought to all of her guidance about complex moral and ethical questions. "So you think he didn't deserve to be fired?" "I think he deserved to face consequences for his poor judgment and inadequate procedures," Dorothy replied. "Whether those consequences should have included termination is a decision that the board was better positioned to make than either of us. What I think is most important now is that the facility moves forward with leadership that will treat all residents with dignity and respect." Their conversation reflected Dorothy's consistent approach to conflicts and challenges throughout her time at Sunrise Manor. She focused on practical solutions rather than personal revenge, and she maintained perspective about the broader implications of individual actions and decisions. These qualities had served her well throughout her government career, and they continued to influence her civilian relationships and community involvement. Dr. Hayes found Dorothy in the library later that afternoon and confirmed the news about Walsh's termination while providing additional details about the transition to interim leadership. "Mrs. Miller," Dr. Hayes said, "I wanted to personally inform you about the administrative changes and assure you that your residency status and care arrangements will remain unchanged during the transition." "Thank you, Dr. Hayes," Dorothy replied. "I appreciate your consideration in keeping me informed. Do you know anything about the interim administrator who'll be taking over Mr. Walsh's responsibilities?" "Her name is Linda Harrison, and she has extensive experience in senior care administration," Dr. Hayes explained. "She's known for collaborative management style and resident-centered care planning. I think you'll find her approach quite different from Mr. Walsh's methods." "That sounds promising," Dorothy said. "Change can be challenging for everyone in a community like this, so I hope the transition goes smoothly." Dr. Hayes nodded, appreciating Dorothy's focus on the community's well-being rather than her personal vindication. "Mrs. Miller, I hope you know that your handling of the situation with Mr. Walsh was admired by everyone on the medical staff. You showed grace under pressure and found a way to resolve the conflict without creating additional problems for other residents." "I had help," Dorothy replied, her tone carrying gratitude for the support she'd received from federal agencies and acknowledgement of the advantages that came with her background and connections. "Not everyone in similar situations would have access to the resources that were available to me." "That's true," Dr. Hayes agreed, "but not everyone would have used those resources as responsibly as you did. You could have caused much more disruption and embarrassment for the facility, but you chose to address the immediate problem without unnecessarily damaging the institution or the people who work here." The conversation reflected the respect that Dorothy had earned from Sunrise Manor's professional staff through her measured response to Walsh's eviction attempt. Her willingness to use her connections to protect herself while minimizing collateral damage had demonstrated the same kind of strategic thinking and operational discipline that had characterized her government career. Linda Harrison arrived at Sunrise Manor the following week and immediately began meeting with residents, families, and staff to understand the facility's culture and address any concerns that had developed during the transition period. Her first meeting with Dorothy took place in the common room during afternoon social hour, when most residents were available for informal conversation. "Mrs. Miller," Harrison said, introducing herself with the kind of respectful directness that suggested she'd been briefed about Dorothy's background and the circumstances that had led to Walsh's termination. I wanted to personally assure you that the facility is committed to providing you with the highest quality care and accommodations for as long as you choose to make Sunrise Manor your home." Dorothy appreciated Harrison's straightforward approach and her obvious effort to address any lingering concerns about administrative stability. "Thank you, Ms. Harrison. I'm pleased to meet you, and I'm grateful for your commitment to the residents' well-being." "I've reviewed the situation that led to my predecessor's departure," Harrison continued, "and I want you to know that the facility has implemented new procedures to ensure that resident evaluations include comprehensive background reviews and consultation with medical staff before any housing decisions are made." "That sounds like a positive development for everyone here," Dorothy replied. "Residents deserve to have their individual circumstances understood and respected, and staff members deserve to have clear procedures that help them make informed decisions." Harrison's expression showed genuine appreciation for Dorothy's balanced perspective on administrative improvements that had been prompted by her own negative experience with Walsh's management. "Mrs. Miller, I hope you'll feel comfortable approaching me or any member of the staff if you have concerns or suggestions about facility operations. Your experience and perspective would be valuable in helping us maintain the kind of community that serves everyone's needs effectively." The offer reflected Harrison's recognition that Dorothy's background and connections made her both a valuable resource and a potential advocate for other residents who might face administrative challenges in the future. It also demonstrated the new administration's commitment to collaborative relationships with residents rather than the authoritarian approach that had characterized Walsh's management style. Over the following months, Dorothy's role within the Sunrise Manor community evolved into something that resembled informal leadership rather than simple residency. Other residents brought their concerns and questions to her, confident that her background and connections gave her unique insights into how to address problems effectively. Staff members consulted with her about policies and procedures that affected resident well-being, recognizing that her perspective could help them avoid mistakes and improve their service delivery. The transformation reflected Dorothy's gradual acceptance of a more visible role within a community that had learned to value her presence and expertise. Her retirement from active government service had been motivated by loss and trauma, but her experience at Sunrise Manor had demonstrated that withdrawal from public service didn't require withdrawal from meaningful contribution to community welfare. Frank Chen observed Dorothy's evolving role with the satisfaction of someone who'd recognized her potential for leadership from their first conversation. "Dorothy," he said during one of their evening discussions, "I think you found a way to continue serving your country, just in a different context than your previous career." Dorothy considered Frank's observation with the thoughtfulness that characterized her approach to questions about purpose and meaning in retirement. "I think you might be right, Frank. The work is different, but the goal is the same: protecting people who need help and contributing to community safety and stability. And you're doing it in a way that allows you to build relationships and enjoy normal civilian life," Frank added. "That seems like a better balance than the isolation that characterized your previous work." "Much better," Dorothy agreed, her voice carrying contentment that had been absent during her years of withdrawal following her retirement from government service. "I've learned that experience and expertise are only valuable if they're shared in ways that help others, and that service doesn't require sacrifice of personal relationships and community connections." Their conversation was overheard by Mrs. Patterson, who'd been listening to their discussions about service and retirement with growing understanding of the themes that connected Dorothy's past and present experiences. "Dorothy," she said, "I still don't understand exactly what kind of work you did before coming here, but I can see that you're still doing important work now. This place is better because you're here, and all of us feel safer and more cared for because of your presence." Dorothy's expression showed deep appreciation for Mrs. Patterson's sentiment and recognition of the community she'd helped create at Sunrise Manor. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That means more to me than you know." As the seasons changed, and Dorothy's first year at Sunrise Manor drew to a close, the facility had become a model for resident-centered care and collaborative administration that reflected lessons learned from the crisis that had prompted Walsh's termination and Harrison's appointment. Dorothy's presence had catalyzed improvements in communication, conflict resolution, and community building that benefited everyone associated with the facility. Tommy Rivera had begun taking college courses in criminal justice, inspired by his conversations with Dorothy about careers in government service, and motivated by her encouragement to pursue meaningful work that helped protect others. Maria Santos had shared Dorothy's advice with her daughter, who'd accepted an internship with the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit and was planning to pursue a career in federal law enforcement after graduation. Dr. Hayes had collaborated with Harrison to develop new resident evaluation procedures that included comprehensive background reviews and multiple staff consultations before any significant care or housing decisions were made. The changes ensured that future administrators would understand residents as complete individuals rather than simply medical and financial profiles. Frank Chen had become Dorothy's closest friend and confidant, and their relationship had demonstrated the value of connections between people who'd shared similar experiences in service to their country. Their friendship provided both of them with understanding and companionship that enriched their retirement years and validated their continuing contribution to community welfare. The ripple effects of Dorothy's confrontation with Walsh had extended far beyond Sunrise Manor to influence policies and practices in senior care facilities throughout the region. The case had become a model for how residents with unusual backgrounds could be accommodated and valued rather than misunderstood and marginalized. Admiral Rebecca Torres had monitored Dorothy's situation through regular reports from the team that had responded to her initial call for assistance. The successful resolution of the crisis had validated the decision to maintain communication channels with retired operators and provide support when civilian resources proved inadequate. The Miller case demonstrates the value of maintaining operational networks beyond active service. Torres had written in her report to Naval Special Warfare Command, "Retired operators continue to serve their communities in civilian roles, and their effectiveness in those roles is enhanced when they know that support remains available during crises that exceed normal civilian resources." The report had contributed to policy decisions that expanded support services for retired special operations personnel and improved coordination between active military units and veteran services organizations. Dorothy's experience had influenced programs that helped other retired operators navigate civilian life while maintaining connections to the military communities that had shaped their professional identities. On the anniversary of her arrival at Sunrise Manor, Dorothy reflected on the transformation that had occurred in her understanding of retirement, community, and continued service. The facility had become home in ways that transcended simple housing arrangements, and the relationships she'd built had provided meaning and purpose that validated her decision to engage with civilian life, rather than maintaining the isolation that had characterized her first years after leaving government service. The photograph on her nightstand still showed 4 women whose sacrifice had never been publicly acknowledged, but Dorothy's experience at Sunrise Manor had demonstrated that their legacy could be honored through continued service in different contexts. The values and commitments that had motivated their classified work could find expression in civilian communities that needed protection, advocacy, and leadership. As Dorothy prepared for sleep in her small room overlooking the parking lot where federal agents had arrived in response to her call for help, she felt gratitude for the community she'd found and the opportunity to continue contributing to the welfare of others. Her retirement from active government service had begun with loss and withdrawal, but it had evolved into engagement and leadership that honored both her past sacrifice and her present opportunities. The quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout her confrontation with Walsh had earned respect and trust that transcended the mystery surrounding her background. The residents and staff of Sunrise Manor might never know the details of her classified service, but they understood that her presence represented something valuable and important that enriched their community and enhanced their security. Dorothy Miller had found a way to remain a protector and advocate without compromising operational security or sacrificing personal relationships. Her experience at Sunrise Manor had proved that retirement from active service didn't require retirement from meaningful contribution to community welfare, and that the skills and values developed through classified work could find expression in civilian contexts that needed leadership and protection. The story of her confrontation with Brandon Walsh had become a legend within the senior care community, inspiring other residents to advocate for themselves, and encouraging administrators to treat elderly clients with dignity and respect. The federal agents who'd responded to her call had returned to their duties knowing that their intervention had protected someone who'd served her country with distinction and had continued that service in civilian contexts that deserved support and recognition. As the facility settled into the quiet routine of evening, Dorothy's room remained a sanctuary where classified memories coexisted with civilian friendships, where professional skills found expression in community service, and where a retired operator had discovered that the most important missions sometimes involved protecting the dignity and welfare of people whose names would never appear in official records, but whose lives had value that transcended any administrative convenience or institutional profit margin. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve her community and support people who needed advocacy and protection. Tonight brought the satisfaction of knowing that she'd found a way to honor her past while building a future that validated both her sacrifice and her continued commitment to protecting others. The quiet room overlooked a parking lot where ordinary vehicles were parked, but Dorothy Miller's presence ensured that extraordinary resources remained available when protection and justice required intervention beyond normal civilian capabilities. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.